Welcome everyone. Many of you have probably noticed a recent shift from Kyrian to Night Fae in Season 4 Mythic Plus, so in this video I'll go over why that shift has occurred and what it means for you. First and foremost, if you enjoy playing a particular covenant, I'm not telling you should swap off that covenant to another one. I'm simply explaining why many of the top players have swapped to Night Fae so you can make the best decision for you. So why were people playing Kyrian in Season 3? The value of Kyrian in Season 3 mostly boiled down to being able to do big damage with Boon of the Ascended, which had its cooldown reduced by Unity, Mechanicos, and the Earth seasonal affix. And while there were a few very difficult fights to heal, it generally wasn't much of a challenge to get full damage value out of Boon, or at least get enough value to warrant running the Covenant. So what changed in Season 4? One of the biggest changes that devalued Kyrian is the removal of the cooldown reduction seasonal affix. With no longer reducing Boon's cooldown, the DPS gap between Kyrian and Night Fae has narrowed. Second, there are a lot more fights this season requiring massive healing. Night Fae's mana regeneration and damage reduction fairies make healing the hardest fights easier. Players are also finding it more difficult to get high value boons during those big damage fights. And finally, the raw DPS gain from giving one of your DPS players cooldown reduction has gone up due to gear scaling and how the seasonal affix magnifies the damage of cooldown windows. So what does this mean for you as a player? Should you play Night Fae or Kyrian? First of all, Kyrian is still a very solid choice for keys, and I believe still the optimal choice under certain conditions. If you find yourself getting full value from Boon of the Ascended and you aren't having significant problems healing, there's really no reason to swap to Night Fae unless you just enjoy it more. Personally, I think Kyrian is much more fun, and even though the DPS gap has narrowed, Boon still does a massive amount of damage. But as you climb into higher and higher keys, you might start struggling to heal certain fights and losing out on Boon damage due to those healing requirements. If you find yourself in this situation, swapping to Night Fae might be the play. So if you play Night Fae, how can you get full value from Fae Guardians? There's much more complexity and nuance to this ability compared to its Boon counterpart, so I want to go over some of the best ways to use it. After all, if you're not getting the most value out of this ability, why not just go back to Kyrian? First, let's briefly talk about how the ability functions. When you cast Fae Guardians, your target will either be friendly or hostile. If you cast Fae Guardians on a hostile target, you immediately put Wrathful Fairy and Mask on your target, and Benevolent Fairy and Guardian Fairy defaults to being cast on you. If you cast Fae Guardians on a friendly target, your Wrathful Fairy will cast on a random hostile target, and your Benevolent Fairy, Guardian Fairy, and Mask will go on your target. If both Benevolent and Guardian Fairy are on a target when Mask is applied, the Mask effect will default to doubling the Benevolent Fairy for extra cooldown reduction. This is important to know because if you want to give a target 40% damage reduction instead of 20%, you have to make sure that the target does not have Benevolent Fairy. Fae Guardians can be a bit confusing and requires a lot of micromanagement to get full value. So the question you should always ask yourself when you cast Fae Guardians is, what is the primary purpose of casting that particular Fae Guardians? If you're really low on mana and not sure you'll make it through the fight, you might want to put the mask on the boss to double your mana regeneration. If someone is taking large, sustained incoming damage, like Medivh's Flame Wreath ability, you might want to move your mask to your Guardian Fairy target for extra damage reduction. But most of the time, you probably want to double the cooldown reduction of one of your DPS players with Benevolent Fairy. The tricky thing about Benevolent Fairy on a DPS player is after playing Kyrian, it takes a lot of discipline to not use your Surge of Light procs on other people. Don't forget that Benevolent Fairy follows your flash heal target. Obviously, if you need to flash heal someone else, flash heal them. But the more you can avoid doing this, the better your group's DPS will be. So who are the best targets for your cooldown reduction Benevolent Fairy? With 24 DPS specs, there is no definitive right or wrong answer, but I'll explain how I select a target. The first thing to remember is, unlike Power Infusion, which you can never really go wrong casting on someone, casting Benevolent Fairies on certain DPS specs can actually cause more harm than good. Many DPS players line up their big cooldowns with on-use trinkets or other abilities, so they could end up using their major cooldown too early and desyncing everything, or they could end up just holding their cooldown, giving you zero value from the cooldown reduction. The best targets for Benevolent Fairies are specs that don't sync their major cooldowns with anything and who benefit from just full setting their cooldowns on cooldown. Ideally, I like to give my PI to a 2-minute spec with an on-use trinket for the multiplicative bonus, and give my Benevolent Fairy to a spec that is just trying to maximize cooldown throughput. As an example, I run with a Warlock and a Survival Hunter. The Survival Hunter uses a 2-minute versatility trinket with his Coordinated Assault, so I use PI on him. Our Warlock just full sends his cooldowns on cooldown, so I use Benevolent Fairy on him. I am not telling you to always PI Hunters and always use your fairies on Warlocks. I'm simply saying understand how the DPS specs in your group work and try to get the most value you can. One thing I did to help with this decision is I added all the abilities the Benevolent Fairy reduces to my cooldown tracker so I can be sure I'm getting the most value. I was running a key the other day and a big damage burn phase was coming up. I noticed my Warlock was already holding his cooldowns, but our Rogue had Adrenaline Rush on cooldown. Although I usually used fairies on the Warlock, I popped it on the Rogue to make sure everyone had full cooldowns for the boss burn phase. The possibilities are endless with this ability. I hope this guide helps shine a little bit of light on the recent shift from Kyrian to Night Fae in Mythic Plus. Have you swapped to Night Fae for keys, and if so, how have you been liking it? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel so you don't miss out on any new videos. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask me while I'm streaming live here on YouTube or over on Twitch. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.